Hello guys, welcome back to Boring Historian. Tonight, we are pulling up a rough-hewn stool at a trestle table in a world lit by smoky tallow candles. We're here to talk about food, that most fundamental human need, but forget your modern images of farm-to-table freshness or delicate flavor profiles. We're diving into a culinary landscape that was often desperate, brutally monotonous, and at times, downright dangerous. Picture a slab of dark, heavy bread in your hand, so dense it could be used as a doorstop, and a mysterious, bubbling pottage in a bowl before you. What you're about to hear might stick with you, and it will almost certainly make you appreciate that stale cracker in the back of your pantry. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. I always love to see where you're all tuning in from. So please drop your city and your local time in the comments. All right, find your quiet space. Let the outside world fade. And let's begin our journey. You are sitting down to a meal. It doesn't matter if you are a humble peasant or a middling artisan. The object that dominates your table, the absolute center of your culinary universe, is bread. We think of bread as a side dish, an accompaniment to the main event. For you, in medieval Europe, bread is the main event. It accounts for as much as 80% of your daily calorie intake. It is the fuel that gets you through a long day of plowing a field or hammering at a forge. It is, quite literally, the staff of life. But this staff is a heavy, crooked, and treacherous thing to lean on. Let's look at the loaf in your hand. Forget any notion of a light, airy, crusty baguette. The bread of the common person is a dense, dark, and formidable brick. It's made not from refined wheat, but from coarser grains like rye, barley, oats, or a common mixture of wheat and rye known as maslin. The color is a deep, grayish brown. The texture is heavy and damp, and the taste has a distinct sour tang. This is your reality, day in and day out. But the disappointment doesn't stop with its humble ingredients. The problems begin at the very first stage of production, the mill. You've harvested your grain, and now you must have it ground into flour. You take your sack to the local mill, which is powered by wind or water. The millstones that grind the grain are, of course, made of stone, as these two massive stones grind against each other for hours on end. Tiny, abrasive particles of stone and sand flake off and mix directly into your flour. There is no way to avoid this. Every single bag of flour produced is contaminated with a fine layer of grit. When this flour is baked into your daily bread, that grit remains. Every bite you take involves a faint, but ever-present, crunching sensation. It's the feeling of your teeth slowly being sanded down. If you look at the skeletal remains of medieval people, one of the most common features is extreme dental wear. Their teeth are often ground down flat to the gum line, not from cavities, but from a lifetime of chewing on sandy, gritty bread. It was a slow, inevitable process of erosion, all thanks to the very food that was supposed to sustain you. The grit from the millstones was an unavoidable problem, but there were other, more deliberate adulterations to worry about. A dishonest baker, looking to stretch his precious flour and maximize his profits, might be tempted to add filler to the dough. This could include relatively harmless things like ground-dried peas or beans, but it could also be far worse. It wasn't unheard of for bakers to be caught mixing in sawdust, chalk, or even dirt to bulk up their loaves. This was, of course, highly illegal. Towns had strict regulations, and a baker caught selling adulterated bread could be fined heavily, publicly shamed by being dragged through the streets with the offending loaf tied around his neck, or even banned from the trade. But the temptation was always there, so you could never be entirely sure what was in your bread besides flour and grit. Once you had your dough, either from the baker or mixed yourself, it had to be baked. Most homes did not have their own ovens. A private oven was a luxury and a significant fire risk in a town made mostly of wood and thatch. Instead, You would take your prepared dough to the communal town oven. This large central oven was often owned by the local lord or the monastery, and you had to pay a fee for its use. This fee, called the fernage, was another small tax on your existence. This system is the source of a lively debate among historians. On one hand, the communal oven was a sensible piece of public safety infrastructure. Centralizing the baking process dramatically reduced the risk of catastrophic fires. It also, in theory, allowed the Lord's baker to enforce a certain standard of quality. But on the other hand, it was a monopoly. The Lord could set the price, and you had no choice but to pay it. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of the Lord's oven was public safety and quality control, or if it was, at its heart, just another clever instrument of economic control and extortion. So your bread is gritty, potentially full of sawdust, and you've had to pay a fee to have it baked. But there is one more terrifying danger lurking in your loaf, a danger that could poison not just you, but your entire village. This danger came from a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, more commonly known as ergot. Ergot thrives on rye, that staple grain of the common people, especially in cool, damp weather. It appears as a small, dark purple or blackish growth, like a little spur or horn, replacing a normal kernel of rye. When the contaminated rye is harvested and milled, the ergot is ground right into the flour, along with the grain and the grit. The fungus itself is harmless, but it produces a range of powerful alkaloids that are anything but. These chemicals are closely related to lysergic acid, from which LSD is derived. When you eat bread baked from this contaminated flour, you are, in essence, being poisoned. The resulting condition was known as St. Anthony's fire, and it was one of the most horrific and bizarre afflictions of the medieval world. It came in two forms. The first was convulsive ergotism, which attacked the nervous system. Sufferers would experience agonizing muscle spasms, convulsions, and vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Entire villages could seem to go mad, with people dancing uncontrollably in the streets, speaking gibberish, and seeing demonic visions. The second form was gangrenous ergotism. This began with an intense burning sensation in the limbs, as if they were on fire. This was followed by the onset of gangrene. The tissue would die, turn black, and mummify. Fingers, toes, hands, and feet would eventually become numb and simply fall off, often without any bleeding. Suddenly, your trusty sourdough starter seems pretty benign, doesn't it? Now, all this misery was the domain of the common person. If you were a member of the nobility, your bread was a world away. The wealthy ate fine white bread made from meticulously sifted wheat flour. This was known as manchette bread, and it was the ultimate status symbol. The whiter and lighter your bread, the richer and more powerful you were. It was soft, it was pure, and it was entirely free of grit. It was a visible, edible declaration of your superiority. But even this fine white bread often had a dirty job to do. One of the most common uses for bread at a noble's table was as a plate. A thick, square slab of day-old, slightly stale bread, called a trencher, was placed in front of each diner. You would then place your meat and other foods directly onto this bread plate. The trencher would soak up all the juices, sauces, and grease from the meal. At the end of the feast, if you were still hungry, you might eat your gravy-soaked trencher. More often, however, these used edible plates were collected from the tables and given as alms to the poor who waited at the castle gates. In a very real sense, the lowest of the low were surviving on the used, leftover plates of the rich. So this is your starting point, your foundation for every meal. Bread is life, but that life is a daily gamble. Your loaf is heavy, sour, and grinds your teeth down to nubs. It might be bulked up with things that shouldn't be in it, and it might, if you are particularly unlucky, be laced with a psychedelic poison that could make you dance until your limbs turned black. This single, most fundamental food item tells a grim story. If this is what they had to work with for the very base of their diet, you can only imagine what horrors they had to endure when it came to the things they put on top of it. The next step on our culinary journey takes us to the most prized and most problematic of all medieval foods, meat. If this is what they had to work with for the very base of their diet, you can only imagine what horrors they had to endure when it came to the things they put on top of it. The next logical step on our culinary journey takes us to the most prized and most problematic of all medieval foods, meat. In the medieval mind, meat was the ultimate symbol of wealth, power, and celebration. A feast was not a feast without a great roasted beast at its center. To eat meat was to partake in the life of the nobility, to feel strong and prosperous. That, at least, was the dream. The reality, for most people on most days, was something else entirely. It was a tough, grim, and incredibly salty ordeal. The central, insurmountable problem is time. You live in a world without refrigeration. When an animal is slaughtered, whether it's a pig from your own small yard or a cow belonging to a great manor, you are suddenly faced with hundreds of pounds of flesh that will begin to spoil within days, or even hours in the summer heat. You cannot possibly eat it all before it turns. Therefore, the vast majority of meat consumed in medieval Europe was not fresh. It was preserved. And the methods of preservation were brutal, prioritizing longevity over any semblance of texture or flavor. The undisputed king of preservation was salt. This wasn't the gentle curing you might imagine for a fine prosciutto. This was a full-scale chemical assault. Imagine a massive wooden barrel. You lay down a thick layer of coarse gray salt, then a layer of butchered meat, then another thick layer of salt, and so on, until the barrel is packed tight. Or you might submerge the cuts of meat in a vat of brine so saturated with salt that an egg would float on its surface. The salt works by osmosis, aggressively drawing moisture out of the meat. This desiccated environment is hostile to the bacteria that cause spoilage, effectively stopping decay in its tracks. However, this process also fundamentally changes the meat itself. The vibrant red muscle turns a deep, dark, angry mahogany. The texture, robbed of all its moisture, becomes dense, fibrous, and incredibly tough. And the taste is, of course, overwhelmingly salty. This is the meat you will be eating for most of the year. Salt pork, salt beef, salt mutton. Before you can even think about cooking it, you have to undertake a lengthy desalting process. You must soak the hard, salt-caked chunk of meat in fresh water for hours, sometimes for a full day or more, changing the water repeatedly to try and leach out some of the ferocious saltiness. Even after all this effort, the final product, once boiled, remains tougher than shoe leather and carries a powerful saline kick that would make your eyes water. It makes modern beef jerky look like a tender, juicy filet mignon. Other preservation methods, like smoking and air drying, yielded similar results. A side of bacon or a ham would be hung in the rafters of a smoky chimney for weeks until it was blackened and hard as a rock. Fish and fowl could be air dried in the wind until they were stiff and leathery. In all cases, the goal was the same: to remove moisture and create a product that could last through the long, lean months of winter. Deliciousness was a distant, secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. Even with these Herculean efforts, preservation was an imperfect science. The line between cured and spoiled was often blurry. Meat could develop a certain funk, a gaminess that hinted it was just on the verge of turning. The fat, in particular, was prone to going rancid, acquiring a sharp, unpleasant taste. For the most part, this was simply accepted. A bit of a tang was just part of the flavor profile of preserved meat. You ate it anyway, because the alternative was having no meat at all. So, did the common person ever get to taste fresh meat? This is a point of ongoing discussion. Historians still argue about the true balance of preserved versus fresh meat in a peasant's diet. On one hand, access to fresh meat was severely restricted. The forests and the deer within them belonged to the Lord. Poaching was a crime often punishable by mutilation or death. A peasant family's most valuable possession might be a single pig. When that pig was finally slaughtered in the autumn, it was a huge event, but it was also a moment of intense work. Only a small portion of the animal could be eaten fresh. The vast majority had to be immediately preserved to provide for the family for the rest of the year. On the other hand, a peasant household might have access to other smaller sources of fresh meat. You might keep chickens, providing a steady supply of eggs and the occasional scrawny bird for the pot. You might be allowed to trap small game like rabbits or birds, and the autumn slaughter of that pig, while mostly for preservation, did mean a brief, joyous feast of fresh pork for the family and their neighbors. So fresh meat wasn't entirely a myth for the poor, but it was a rare seasonal treat, a brief respite from the monotonous reality of salt meat. One thing is certain, when an animal was killed, absolutely nothing went to waste. This is where you get into the world of offal, or what we might call variety meats. This wasn't a trendy chef's novelty. It was a simple necessity. The internal organs were often the first things eaten after a slaughter, as they spoiled the fastest. You would find pies filled with a mixture of minced heart, lungs, and liver. These were known as umbles, and it's from this practice of the poor eating these humble innards that we get the phrase, "To eat humble pie." Blood was drained and mixed with oats or barley to create black pudding. The stomach lining was cleaned and boiled into tripe. Even the animal's head would be boiled for hours until the meat fell from the bones, then set in its own gelatin to create a wobbly, meaty jelly known as head cheese. The ingenuity of what could be considered food is perhaps best captured by the strange case of the beaver. The church calendar was filled with fast days, free days, all of Lent, and other holy days where eating meat was forbidden. This amounted to more than a third of the year, but the definition of meat could be flexible. Because the beaver was an aquatic animal with a flat, scaly tail, the church, in its wisdom, classified it as a fish. This meant that on a holy day of fasting, you could piously adhere to the rules while chewing on the fatty, roasted tail of a beaver. If you lived in a town, you would likely get your meat from a butcher's stall in the marketplace. This was not a pleasant, sterile environment. The stall was open to the air, and the butchered carcasses would hang from hooks, swarming with flies. The ground would be slick with blood, and the smell was overwhelming. You had to be a savvy customer, able to inspect the meat closely and smell it for the telltale signs of true spoilage. An unscrupulous butcher might try to disguise the smell of bad meat with strong-smelling herbs, or by rubbing the surface with fresh blood to make it look newer than it was. You arrive back at your table, your slab of gritty bread in one hand, ready for its topping. You hack off a piece of the boiled salt pork you've been soaking all day. You chew, and you chew, and you chew. Texture is tough and fibrous, and despite all the soaking, the taste of salt still dominates everything. It is protein. It is calories. It is survival. But it is a grim, joyless, and punishing experience. The luxury of meat, you realize, is a constant, desperate battle against the forces of nature. A battle fought with mountains of salt, clouds of smoke, and a very strong stomach. And this battle wasn't only fought with the beasts of the land. For more than 100 days of the year, the church forbade you from eating them at all. On those days, you had to turn to the rivers and the seas for your protein. A prospect that was often even more unpleasant and disgusting. On those days, you had to turn to the rivers and the seas for your protein. A prospect that was often even more unpleasant and disgusting. Welcome to Fish Day. It is Friday, or perhaps a day in the long, dreary 40 days of Lent. and the authority of the Catholic Church reaches directly onto your plate. For more than a third of the year, the consumption of meat and animal fats is forbidden. This is not a suggestion. It is a divine mandate, and to break it is a sin. This religious obligation created a colossal, continent-wide demand for fish, a food that, for the vast majority of people living away from the coast, was a rank and wretched affair. If you live in a small fishing village, you might enjoy the luxury of a fresh catch, grilled over a fire moments after being pulled from the sea. But for you, living even 20 miles inland, that fresh fish is an impossible dream. It spoils even faster than meat, turning into a foul-smelling mush within a day. So, just like the pig in your yard, the fish from the sea must be preserved. The methods are similar: salting, smoking, and drying, but the results are, if anything, even more grim. Let's start with one of the great staples of the fish day diet, the herring. These small, oily fish were caught in the North Sea in unimaginable numbers. To preserve them, they were gutted, packed in barrels of salt, and then often heavily smoked for weeks. The result of this process was the infamous red herring. The intense smoking turned the fish's skin a dark, coppery red and imbued its flesh with a pungent, acrid flavor that clung to the back of your throat. The texture was tough and leathery, and the saltiness was so profound it made your tongue curl. The smell was legendary. In fact, the expression, a red herring, meaning a distraction or a false trail, comes from the practice of using the overpoweringly smelly smoked fish to train hunting dogs to follow a scent. That your dinner is also a useful tool for canine training tells you a lot about its culinary appeal. If you weren't eating red herring, you were likely eating stockfish. This was the other pillar of the preserved fish economy, and it was typically made from cod, caught in the cold, clean waters of the North Atlantic by fishermen from Norway, Iceland, or England. The process was simple and brutally effective. The cod was gutted, split down the middle, and then hung by its tail over large wooden racks, or stocks. There it would hang for months in the freezing, dry air. No salt was used. The wind alone wicked away every last drop of moisture. The resulting product was less a piece of food and more a piece of lumber. The stockfish was bone dry, rigid, and so hard you could probably knock someone out with it. In this state, it was practically immortal. It could be stored for years without spoiling. It was also completely inedible. To transform this fish plank back into something that could be eaten was a multi-day ordeal. First, you had to beat the stockfish mercilessly with a wooden mallet, trying to break up the dense, hardened muscle fibers. Then, you had to submerge the bruised fish in water, leaving it to soak for several days, changing the water frequently. Only then would it be soft enough to be boiled or stewed. And after all that work, the final texture was often described as stringy, woolly, and bland. It was a food born of pure necessity, a protein source of last resort. Between the salty misery of the red herring and the woody blandness of the stockfish, there was a strange and stinky middle ground, the green fish. This was typically cod that had been lightly salted but not dried hard. This meant it retained more of its moisture, which was good, but it also meant it was only semi-preserved, which was bad. Green fish had to be rushed inland from the coast, and it had a notoriously powerful smell, a sharp tang of ammonia and decay that could fill a room. Yet, because its texture was softer and more palatable than the woody stockfish, it was often considered a slight upgrade. You were essentially trading a truly awful smell for a slightly less awful texture. A difficult choice for a Friday dinner. So why did an entire continent subject itself to this culinary punishment? This is where historians find a fascinating intersection of piety and economics. The official reason for the church's fasting rules was, of course, spiritual. Abstaining from the rich, blood-filled meat of land animals was an act of penance and humility. Fish was considered a colder, lesser food. and eating it was a way to tame the passions and focus the mind on God. But historians still argue whether these rules were purely an instrument of faith or if they also functioned as a brilliant tool of economic and resource management. Forcing millions of people to eat fish for over 100 days a year created a guaranteed market that fueled massive international industries. It built the fortunes of coastal fishing towns and gave rise to powerful trading blocs like the Hanseatic League, a confederation of northern German cities that held a near monopoly on the lucrative stockfish trade. On a local level, the rules also functioned as a form of livestock management. By forbidding meat consumption for a third of the year, it forced people to conserve their herds of cattle, sheep, and pigs, ensuring the animals would be available when they were most needed. The rules, whether intentionally or not, had a profound economic impact alongside their spiritual one. If you were a wealthy lord or lived in a monastery, you had another option, one that didn't involve the sea at all. You had your own fish ponds or stews. These were man-made ponds, carefully stocked with freshwater fish like carp, pike, tench, and bream. This gave you a ready supply of fish right at your doorstep. However, these fish came with their own disgusting drawback. They were often bottom feeders, living their lives in the stagnant, muddy water of the pond. As a result, their flesh was famous for having a foul, muddy, or weedy taste. To make them edible, they had to be scoured. This involved catching the fish and keeping them in a separate tank of clean, fresh running water for several days before cooking them, in the hope that they would flush the muddy taste out of their systems. So, you sit down at your table on a day of fasting. Before you is a plate holding a sliver of leathery red herring, its salty, smoky flavor a challenge to your palate. Or perhaps you have a bowl of watery stew containing flakes of rehydrated stockfish, its texture like boiled wool. Or maybe you are lucky enough to have a piece of carp from the Lord's pond, a fish that, despite days of scouring, still tastes faintly of the mud in which it lived. This is your penance. This is your meal. The obligation to eat fish was a weekly reminder of the church's power over your life, a major driver of international trade, and the source of some of the most profoundly unappetizing dishes imaginable. But even on the days when meat was allowed, your meal wasn't always a simple affair of salt pork on gritty bread. More often than not, all your ingredients, whatever they were, ended up in a single perpetually simmering pot of mush. But even on the days when meat was allowed, your meal wasn't always a simple affair of salt pork on gritty bread. More often than not, all your ingredients, whatever they were, ended up in a single perpetually simmering pot of mush. This was the culinary heart of the common household. It was the centerpiece of your diet, the first thing you ate in the morning, and the last thing you ate at night. This was the age of pottage. To understand pottage, you first have to understand the medieval kitchen. For most people, this wasn't a room with multiple burners and gleaming surfaces. It was a single open hearth in the center of your one-room home. And hanging over that fire from a chain was your primary, and perhaps only, piece of cookware. A large cauldron, made of iron or sometimes pottery. This pot was your stove, your oven, and your slow cooker, all in one. And its contents were nearly always the same. Pottage. So what? Exactly, pottage. It's not quite a soup, which is too thin. It's not quite a modern stew, which implies chunks of distinct ingredients. Pottage is a thick, porridge-like slush, a hearty, belly-filling sludge that formed the bedrock of the medieval diet. The foundation of any pottage was grain. This was what provided the calories and the thick, satisfying texture. You'd use whatever was cheap and available. Oats, barley, or rye, often thrown in whole or roughly crushed. This would be boiled in water or, if you were lucky, a thin ale, until the grains swelled and broke down. Into this grainy base went the vegetables. You would add whatever you could pull from your small garden plot, the so-called pottage garden, or forage from the nearby woods and fields. This meant heaps of onions, leeks, and garlic, which provided a savory flavor base. It meant hearty greens like cabbage and kale, and root vegetables like turnips and carrots. Everything was chopped roughly and tossed into the pot to simmer for hours, breaking down into a uniform softness. If you were having a good week, you might add something to flavor the pot. A chunk of that incredibly tough, salty pork we talked about could be simmered for hours until it began to fall apart, its saltiness infusing the entire dish. Or perhaps a sliver of that smoky red herring, its pungent flavor spreading through the mush. Even a simple bone, with no meat left on it at all, could be thrown in to lend a savory, fatty richness to the broth. But the single most disgusting and fascinating aspect of pottage was its continuous nature. This is where we encounter the concept of the perpetual stew. The cauldron was almost never emptied and scrubbed clean. Why would you waste the fuel and effort? At the end of the evening meal, whatever pottage was left in the pot simply stayed there, sitting over the low embers of the dying fire overnight. In the morning, you would stir it up, add more water, more grain, and whatever new ingredients you had for the day, and set it back to bubbling. This means that the pottage you are eating for lunch today contains the remnants of last night's dinner, and last night's dinner contained the leftovers from the meal before that. It is entirely possible that a bit of the herring you ate on Friday is still lurking at the bottom of the pot, now mingling with the cabbage and salt pork you threw in on Saturday. This gives a whole new and slightly terrifying meaning to the concept of leftovers. The taste of the pottage would be constantly evolving, a never-ending symphony of flavors melding together over days and weeks. Of course, this also meant that if one bit of old food at the bottom of the pot started to turn sour or spoil, it could taint the entire new batch, lending a funky, unpleasant taste to your meal that you just had to ignore. So, was this endless pot of mush just a grim, monotonous gruel designed to keep starvation at bay? Or was it something more? Historians and food scientists still argue about the actual nutritional quality of medieval pottage. On the one hand, the case for it being disgusting is strong. It was bland, it was repetitive, and its texture was a uniform sludge. It was the taste of subsistence, not pleasure. However, some argue that it may have been a surprisingly healthy, all-in-one meal. The long, slow cooking process would have broken down the tough cellulose in the vegetables, making their nutrients easier for the body to absorb. More importantly, the practice of throwing in every last scrap, including animal and fish bones, meant that vital minerals like calcium were constantly being leached into the broth. The wide variety of foraged wild greens and herbs, seen as weeds today, could have provided a host of micronutrients that were otherwise missing from the diet. So while it may have been a joyless and unappetizing experience, the perpetual pottage pot may have been a key factor in keeping the population reasonably healthy. Naturally, the pottage of the rich was a different beast entirely. A nobleman would still eat pottage, but it would be an elevated, refined version, sometimes known by a fancy French name like a mortreuse or a civet. The base of a wealthy lord's pottage wouldn't be coarse barley. It would be expensive white breadcrumbs, or even more luxurious, ground almonds, which created a pale, creamy, and smooth texture. It would be thick with chunks of fresh, tender meat like chicken, veal, or pork. And it would be heavily seasoned with exotic imported spices that we'll get to soon. The color, too, was important. A cook might add ground saffron to turn the pottage a brilliant gold, or a pinch of sandalwood to make it a startling red. It was the same dish in principle, but a universe away in terms of flavor, status, and appeal. But for you, back in your humble cottage, the reality is the thick, grayish sludge you scoop from the cauldron into your wooden bowl. You use your gritty rye bread as a spoon, dipping it into the mush to make the bread less dry and the pottage more substantial. The flavor is overwhelmingly of boiled cabbage and grain, with a faint, savory background note of whatever old bone or piece of salt meat is currently flavoring the pot. It is bland, it is filling, and it coats the inside of your mouth with a starchy film. This is the taste of your world, the flavor of monotony. This pot of ever-simmering, ever-changing mush is the baseline of your entire culinary existence. But what happens when you want to escape that baseline? What if you are a wealthy merchant who doesn't have to eat peasant pottage, but you are served a piece of meat that smells just a little bit off? You would then turn to the most powerful and expensive tool in the medieval culinary arsenal. A tool designed to conquer, conceal, and utterly dominate any other flavor in a dish. The spice box. What if you are a wealthy merchant who doesn't have to eat peasant pottage, but you are served a piece of meat that smells just a little bit off? You would then turn to the most powerful and expensive tool in the medieval culinary arsenal. A tool designed to conquer, conceal, and utterly dominate any other flavor in a dish. The spice box. This is where we encounter one of the most persistent ideas about medieval food. The notion that everything was drenched in spices simply to hide the taste of rot. But like so much of medieval history, the truth is a little more complicated and a lot more interesting. Let's tackle this great spice debate head on. The popular theory is simple and intuitive. As we've discussed, without refrigeration, meat and fish were a constant challenge to keep fresh. Preservation methods were harsh, and often the food teetered on the edge of spoilage, acquiring a gamey or rancid taste. What better way to make this tainted food edible than to blast it with a powerful dose of cloves, pepper, and cinnamon? A fistful of spice could easily overpower the taste of decay, allowing a wealthy household to avoid wasting a valuable piece of meat. It makes perfect sense. But this is where historians urge us to pause and consider the other side of the story. The counter-argument, and the one that most food historians lean towards today, is that the use of spices had very little to do with masking spoilage and everything to do with showing off. Spices were, without exaggeration, astronomically expensive. They were rare luxury goods, harvested from tiny islands on the other side of the world and transported to Europe via long, treacherous, and heavily taxed trade routes. A pound of nutmeg in 14th century London could cost the same as a fully grown cow. A small pouch of saffron was literally worth more than a horse. These were not ingredients you would use frivolously. From this perspective, using your most precious and expensive ingredients to salvage your worst quality food makes no economic sense. It would be like taking a brand new, top-of-the-line sports car and using it exclusively to haul garbage. Instead, the lavish use of spices was an act of what economists call conspicuous consumption. It was the medieval equivalent of covering your watch in diamonds or wearing a designer logo the size of a dinner plate. When a lord served a dish that was so heavily spiced it made your eyes water, he wasn't saying, "I hope you can't taste the rot." He was screaming, "I am so fabulously wealthy that I can afford to burn money on my food just to impress you." Each bite was a taste of his power and status. The consensus today is that while the masking effect was certainly a convenient side benefit, the primary driver was the flaunting of wealth. So what was in this treasure chest of flavors? The undisputed king of spices was black pepper. It was the most common of the exotic spices, but still a significant luxury. Then you had the holy trinity of the spice trade: cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, along with its lacy outer covering, mace. These all came from a tiny cluster of islands in modern-day Indonesia, the so-called Spice Islands. The journey to Europe was perilous and controlled by a long chain of merchants, with Venetian and Genoese traders holding the final lucrative monopoly, which is what drove the prices to such incredible heights. Ginger, imported from Asia, was also hugely popular for its fiery heat, as was saffron, the delicate stamens of a specific crocus flower, which imparted a heady aroma and a brilliant golden color to any dish. Because true black pepper was so expensive, cooks often turned to a clever and now largely forgotten substitute: grains of paradise. This was the seed of a plant from the ginger family, grown in West Africa. Because the trade route was much shorter and not controlled by the same monopolies, it was far more affordable than Asian pepper. It had a wonderful, sharp, peppery bite, but with added floral and cardamom-like notes. It became wildly popular, and you'll find it listed in medieval recipe books far more often than true pepper. It was the slightly more accessible, off-brand spice that everyone secretly loved, a quirky and delicious footnote in the history of flavor. The way these spices were used would be completely alien to a modern palate. We use spice to enhance or complement the main ingredient. In a medieval noble's kitchen, spices were used to utterly transform it. A single dish could contain a dozen different spices, all vying for attention. The resulting flavor profile was a powerful, chaotic blend of hot, savory, and sweet. Cooks would have pre-mixed spice powders on hand, like poudre forte strong powder with pepper and cloves for savory dishes, or poudre douce sweet powder with cinnamon and sugar for sweeter ones. Sauces were a primary vehicle for this spice assault. A typical sauce would be thick, often thickened with breadcrumbs, and based on the sour tang of vinegar. Into this sour base would be dumped a shocking amount of spices, and often sugar or honey as well. A famous example, like cameline sauce, might contain cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, all suspended in a mix of vinegar and breadcrumbs. Imagine dipping a piece of chicken into a thick, gritty, sour sauce that tastes overwhelmingly of Christmas spices. That's medieval fine dining. There was another, deeper reason for this love of spice, one that connects back to the humoral theory we explored. In the medieval system of medicine, spices like pepper and cinnamon were considered to be intensely hot and dry. Digestion was seen as a form of cooking, and it was believed that these hot spices helped to cook the food in the stomach, making it easier to digest. They were also seen as the perfect antidote to foods that were considered cold and moist, like fish. Drenching a piece of poached cod in a hot, dry, spicy sauce wasn't just making it taste better. It was a medically sophisticated act of rebalancing the food's fundamental nature before it even entered your body. So, when you served a heavily spiced dish, you were showing off not just your wealth, but your grasp of cutting-edge health and wellness theory. You sit at the high table, a guest at a great feast. The servants bring out a roasted peacock, its feathers reattached to create a spectacular centerpiece. You take a bite of the meat, which has been drenched in a thick, dark sauce. Your mouth immediately explodes in a riot of flavor. There is the heat of pepper and ginger, the warm sweetness of cinnamon, the pungent punch of cloves, and the sharp tang of vinegar. You can barely taste the peacock itself. The flavor is aggressive, complex, and completely overwhelming. It is the taste of money. It is the taste of power. And it is the taste of medieval medical science. But this fiery, expensive, and deliberate culinary excess was a world away from the daily experience of the common person. For them, the liquid chosen to wash down their gritty bread and bland pottage wasn't a fine, spiced wine from France, but a thick, cloudy, and often unreliable brew that served as both food and drink in one single, murky gulp. That fiery, expensive, and deliberate culinary excess was a world away from the daily experience of the common person. For them, the liquid chosen to wash down their gritty bread and bland pottage wasn't a fine, spiced wine from France, but a thick, cloudy, and often unreliable brew that served as both food and drink in one single, murky gulp. To understand medieval food, you must understand medieval drink. And that means wading into a world of ale. First, you have to ask a simple question. Why weren't they all just drinking water? The answer is that water, in many places, was a risky bet. The same rivers and streams that powered the mills and provided fish were also the dumping ground for human and animal waste. Tanners, butchers, and dyers would discard their industrial refuse directly into the water source. To drink from a river downstream of a town was to invite a nasty case of dysentery, or some other waterborne illness. While fresh, clean springs and wells certainly existed and were highly valued, they weren't always available. Water was, in many contexts, simply not safe. The savior, the liquid that fueled the entire society, was ale. The magic of ale, though they didn't understand the science behind it, was in the brewing process. The very first step involves boiling water with malted grain to create a sugary liquid called the bord. This boiling, done to extract the sugars from the grain, unknowingly killed off most of the harmful bacteria and pathogens that might have been lurking in the water. The resulting drink was vastly safer than the water it was made from. Now, when you picture this ale, you must erase the image of a modern, crisp, clear, fizzy beer. The single biggest difference is that medieval ale was unhopped. Hops, the bitter flowers we associate with beer today, were not widely used in brewing in many parts of Europe, especially England, until the late Middle Ages. Hops act as a natural preservative and add that characteristic bitter flavor. Without them, ale was a different beverage entirely. It was often slightly sweet from the malt. It spoiled very quickly, usually within a few days of being made, and its texture was thick, soupy, and cloudy, full of suspended yeast and grain particles. It wasn't just a drink. It was food. This liquid bread was a vital source of calories, B vitamins, and hydration for everyone, from farmhands to noble lords. The production of this essential beverage wasn't an industrial affair. For the most part, it was a domestic chore, like baking or laundry, and it was primarily the domain of women. The brewer in your community was most likely your neighbor, a housewife known as an alewife. She would brew a batch of ale for her own family's consumption, and if she had enough grain to make extra, she would sell the surplus to her neighbors for a small profit. To let the village know she had a fresh batch ready for sale, the alewife would hang an ale stake from an upstairs window or over her door. This was a simple but effective form of advertising. A long pole, often with a green branch or a bunch of leaves tied to the end, signifying that fresh, life-giving ale was available within. The sight of these ale stakes sticking out from houses was a common feature of any medieval street. To ensure a fair price and a decent quality, many towns employed official ale conners, whose job it was to go from house to house, tasting the new batches and judging their quality. It was one of the few jobs in the world where you were required to drink on the clock, and it was taken very seriously. This brings us to a fascinating question. If everyone, including laborers in the fields and even children, was drinking ale throughout the day, was the entire medieval world in a state of constant, low-level inebriation? Historians still argue about the true strength and nature of this daily drink. On one hand, people certainly appreciated the intoxicating effects of a strong ale. Tavern scenes in literature are famous for their drunken revelry, and a brewer's reputation often rested on her ability to produce a potent brew. However, the evidence suggests that people brewed ales of different strengths for different purposes. The strong, celebratory ale was reserved for feasts, festivals, and evening relaxation. For daily consumption, most people, including children, drank what was known as small ale. This was a much weaker beverage, made by using the dregs of the grain from the first, strong batch. The wort would be made from a second or even third rinsing of the same malt, which meant there was far less sugar to be converted into alcohol. The resulting small ale might have had an alcohol content of only 1 or 2%, similar to a modern kombucha. It was caloric, it was hydrating, and it was safe, but it wouldn't have made you particularly drunk. It was the medieval equivalent of a sports drink. Of course, brewing in a home with rudimentary equipment was a fickle business. Without thermometers or an understanding of yeast, a batch could easily go wrong. A wild yeast strain could infect the wort, turning the whole batch sour and undrinkable. If the temperature wasn't right during fermentation, the yeast might not work at all, resulting in a sweet, sticky, non-alcoholic mess. A failed batch was a disaster, a terrible waste of precious grain and firewood. Even when it worked, the final product was a far cry from a modern pint. The ale was served at cellar temperature, not chilled. It was flat, with no carbonation, and it was always murky, as unfiltered yeast and proteins remained suspended in the liquid. The flavor could be inconsistent, ranging from a pleasant malty sweetness to a sharp, sour tang, depending on the skill of the brewer and the luck of the fermentation. While ale was king, there were other options. In regions where grapes grew easily, like France and Spain, wine was the drink of choice for all classes. But in a place like England, wine was an expensive import, a luxury reserved for the nobility and the church. A more common, local alternative in areas with orchards was cider, made from fermented apples, or perry, made from pears. This provided a cheap, potent, and often very rough alcoholic beverage for those who couldn't afford or couldn't brew ale. You lift a heavy earthenware mug to your lips. Inside is the cloudy, brownish liquid that fuels your day. You take a long drink. It's not crisp. It's not refreshing. It's thick, slightly sweet, slightly sour, and you can feel the unfiltered sediment on your tongue. But it's safer than water. It fills your belly, and it provides a dull, caloric warmth that helps you face the hardships of a long day. This liquid bread is the constant, necessary companion to your solid, gritty bread. But now, with your meal of pottage and your mug of ale finished, what comes next? In a world where refined sugar was a medicine and a spice, not a common foodstuff, what did people do when they craved a taste of something sweet? The world of medieval desserts, you will find, was a sticky, strange, and often bizarre affair. That thick, cloudy, and often unreliable brew served as both food and drink in one single murky gulp. You have washed down your gritty bread and your bland pottage with this liquid bread. But now, as the main part of the meal concludes, what happens when a craving for sweetness strikes? In a world where refined sugar was as precious as gold, a world without chocolate bars and ice cream, the pursuit of a sweet taste led to a world of desserts that were sticky, strange, and often bizarre. First, you must understand the fundamental problem. Sugarcane, the source of our modern refined sugar, does not grow in the cold, damp climate of Northern Europe. For you, therefore, sugar is not a common household commodity. It is an expensive, imported luxury item. So, what do you use to sweeten your life? The answer, for almost everyone, is honey. Beekeeping was a vital part of every manor and monastery. You wouldn't see the neat, white, stackable hives of a modern apiary. Instead, you would see rows of skeps, dome-shaped baskets woven from straw. The bees would build their combs inside, and harvesting the honey often meant driving the bees out or destroying the colony. The honey they produced was the workhorse sweetener of the age. But medieval honey was not the light, clear, subtly flavored product you might buy today. It was often dark, unfiltered, and carried the strong, sometimes musky or bitter, flavors of whatever wild flowers the bees had foraged on. Its taste was powerful, and it dominated any dish it was added to. You would use it to brew mead, to glaze roasted meats, and to bake simple, heavy honey cakes. Besides honey, your other main source of sweetness was fruit. You could eat fresh berries or apples in the summer and autumn. For the rest of the year, you relied on dried fruits. For the wealthy, this meant expensive imports like dates and figs, which were packed in sugar syrup and shipped from the Mediterranean. For everyone else, it meant drying your own apples, pears, and plums, concentrating their sweetness into a leathery, long-lasting treat. You could also boil down fruit juices, like grape juice, must, or apple juice, to create thick, sweet syrups that could be used in place of honey. Then there was sugar itself. This, white gold, was imported from distant lands where sugarcane was grown, like Cyprus or Sicily. It was sold not by the pound in a grocery store, but by the ounce at the apothecary, the same place you would buy your medicines and spices. In fact, sugar was considered a spice, and it was often listed alongside pepper, cloves, and saffron in a household's inventory of precious goods. It was also considered a powerful medicine. In the humoral system, sugar was believed to be perfectly balanced, having both hot and moist qualities, which made it an excellent base for other medicines. That old line about a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down was literal truth for a medieval physician, who would use it to make bitter herbal concoctions more palatable for a wealthy patient. A joke about being prescribed sugar by your doctor seems a lot less funny when you realize it actually happened. Because of its immense cost, using sugar in your cooking was one of the ultimate status symbols, just like using spices. But what did this dessert actually consist of? This is where we run into another interesting debate. Historians still argue whether a distinct sweet final course, as we know it today, truly existed for most of the Middle Ages. For much of the period, the lines between sweet and savory were incredibly blurry. It was very common for dishes to be served together that we would find jarring. A meat pie might be heavily sweetened with honey and studded with dried fruit, served right alongside a salted fish. Sugar and spices were sprinkled on meat and vegetables, not just on custards and tarts. The idea of a meal progressing neatly from savory to sweet was not firmly established. However, as the Middle Ages progressed, especially in the wealthiest households, a final, separate course did begin to emerge. This was known as the void, or the issue to table, which literally means exit from the table. After the main dishes were cleared away, servants would bring out a lighter course to be enjoyed as the diners relaxed. This might include fresh fruits, nuts, and most importantly, comfits. These were single seeds, like aniseed, caraway, or fennel, which were coated in a hard layer of sugar. They were the ancestors of jawbreakers and gobstoppers, a tiny, crunchy, spicy sweet treat that was seen as a digestive aid. Alongside these, you might be served spiced wine, called hippocras, which was red wine heavily sweetened with sugar and flavored with cinnamon, ginger, and other hot spices, also believed to help settle the stomach after a heavy meal. The desserts themselves ranged from the simple to the bizarre. You would find fruit tarts and pies with a thick pastry crust, and a filling of apples or pears sweetened with a generous amount of honey. You would have baked custards and puddings, thick with eggs and milk, but also sometimes containing savory ingredients like bone marrow alongside the sweet ones. A popular treat was a wafer, a very thin, crisp cookie, like a modern ice cream cone, flavored with anise or ginger, and cooked between the plates of a decorative, long-handled iron held over the fire. One particularly strange but common dish was leche lombard, a thick pudding made of dates and honey, sweetened and spiced wine, and thickened with breadcrumbs, which sounds reasonable until you learn that recipes often called for it to be studded with chunks of ground meat or marrow. The sweet and savory combination would be a shock to most modern palates, but the absolute pinnacle of medieval dessert making, and the ultimate example of spectacle over substance, was the subtlety, or subtlety, or subtlety. This was a sculpture, often fantastically elaborate, made from a sugar paste, similar to marzipan or modern gum paste. A subtlety was not really meant to be eaten. Its purpose was to be a conversation piece, an edible centerpiece brought out between courses at a magnificent feast to dazzle the guests. These sugar sculptures could be astonishingly complex. A cook, who had to be as much an artist as a chef, might create a miniature castle, complete with knights and banners, or a scene from mythology, like St. George slaying the dragon, or a group of saints performing a miracle. The sugar paste would be molded, carved, and then painted with food-safe colorants like saffron for yellow or boiled vegetable juice for green. The disgusting part: these sculptures took hours or even days to make, being handled extensively by the cooks. They would sit out in the great hall, collecting dust. And worse, because sugar was so expensive, the subtleties were often saved and reused from one feast to the next. So, while you could technically eat it, doing so would be like deciding to take a bite out of a dusty, frequently handled year-old Christmas ornament. You stand in the great hall, admiring the magnificent sugar castle that has been placed on the high table. A brilliant white testament to your host's immense power and wealth. You know it's for looking, not for eating, which, considering how long it's been sitting around, is probably for the best. Your actual taste of sweetness for the evening has been a sticky honey tart, or perhaps a single sugar-coated caraway seed. You've learned that the experience of sweetnesses in this world is powerful, often cloying, and almost entirely defined by the flavor of honey or the aggressive punch of spices. But this experience, however strange, is one of relative abundance. What happened when the rains didn't come? When the crops failed and the Lord's granaries were empty? What did you eat then? The answer to that question takes us into the darkest and most desperate corner of the medieval menu, the world of famine food. But this experience, however strange, is one of relative abundance. What happened when the rains didn't come? When the crops failed and the Lord's granaries were empty? What did you eat then? The answer to that question takes us into the darkest and most desperate corner of the medieval menu, the world of famine food. Here, the concept of disgusting is transformed from a matter of taste and texture into a matter of life and death. You must first understand how perilously close to the edge of starvation most of the population lived. In our world of global supply chains, a failed harvest in one region can be balanced by a surplus from another. For you, living in a small medieval village, the world is your valley, your 100 acres of farmland. You and your neighbors survive almost entirely on what you can grow. If a long, wet summer rots the grain in the fields, or a severe drought withers it on the stalk, there is no relief shipment coming. There is no government aid program. There is simply nothing. The most infamous example of this was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. For 3 consecutive years, Northern Europe was battered by relentless rains and unseasonably cool weather. The fields turned to mud, crops failed catastrophically, and a disaster of unimaginable scale unfolded. This is the world you now find yourself in. The first stage is the eerie quiet of absence. The gritty rye bread, the foundation of your entire existence, is gone. The communal oven is cold. The pottage pot that once simmered endlessly over your hearth is now just a cold, empty cauldron, scoured clean for any last hint of nourishment. The comforting monotony you once knew has been replaced by a gnawing emptiness in your stomach. The first desperate act is to eat the future. You go to the small store of seed grain, the precious kernels you had saved to plant for next year's crop, and you grind it into a final meager batch of flour. It is a terrible choice, a gamble that things might miraculously get better, because by eating your seed, you are guaranteeing that there will be no harvest next year either. Next, you turn to your animals. The chickens, which once gave you eggs, are the first to go. Then comes the hardest decision of all. You look at your single-family cow, or the ox that you rely on to plow your fields. These are not just livestock. They are your most valuable capital assets. To slaughter them is to kill your own ability to farm in the future. But the hunger is too great. The animals are killed, and for a brief, fleeting period, there is meat. But once that is gone, the final buffer between you and true starvation has been eliminated. Now, you must turn to the wild for sustenance, to foods you would never dream of eating in normal times. These are the famine foods. You go to the forest and gather acorns from the oak trees. They are bitter and full of tannins that are toxic to humans, So you must laboriously crush them and soak them in running water for days to leach out the poison before you can try to make a crude, bitter paste from them. You look at the trees themselves not as sources of wood, but as sources of food. You strip the outer bark from an elm or birch tree to get to the soft inner cambium layer. You dry this stringy, fibrous layer and attempt to pound it into a coarse sawdust-like flour, which you can mix with water to create a truly disgusting, nutrient-poor bread. You dig in the dirt for any roots and tubers you can find. You scour the fields for weeds, nettles, dandelions, thistles, boiling them into a thin, watery gruel. You might even resort to eating grass from the meadow, your digestive system struggling to extract any nourishment from the tough cellulose. One of the most telling famine foods was bracken bread. The bracken fern, which grows prolifically in woodlands, has thick, starchy roots known as rhizomes. In times of absolute desperation, people would dig up these rhizomes, dry them, and grind them into a black, gritty flour. This could be mixed with water to form a dense, black bread. It provided calories, and for a starving person, that was all that mattered. We now know that bracken is highly carcinogenic and contains a number of toxins that can cause blindness and other serious health problems. For you, it was a devil's bargain, a food that would keep you alive today, but might be poisoning you for tomorrow. This is where the story enters its darkest chapter. What happens when the bark, the roots, and the weeds are all gone? What happens when your children are crying from hunger and there is nothing left to give them? This is where the historical chronicles fall into hushed, horrified tones. And it is a subject that historians still argue about. How widespread was the ultimate taboo? Cannibalism. The contemporary accounts of the Great Famine are filled with shocking reports. They speak of the poor digging up the bodies of the newly buried from churchyards to eat them. They tell stories of travelers being ambushed and killed on lonely roads. There are whispers of parents abandoning their children in the woods, and even darker rumors of people killing their own. It is, of course, possible that some of these accounts were exaggerated by the chroniclers, who were often monks, to emphasize the sheer horror of the times and the wrath of God. Yet the reports are too numerous and too consistent across different regions to be dismissed entirely. The scholarly consensus is that cannibalism was likely not a widespread practice, but a rare and horrifying act of final stage desperation. It was the absolute last resort for a mind and body pushed far beyond any recognizable human limit. It represents the complete collapse of all moral and social order. And that social breakdown was just as devastating as the hunger itself. In a famine, the bonds of community dissolve. Charity disappears when you don't have enough to feed your own family. Neighbor turns against neighbor, stealing from their pathetic gardens or stores. Law and order crumble. The world shrinks to the size of your own aching belly. And with starvation comes its twin sister, disease. A population weakened by months of malnutrition has no immune response left to fight off infection. Great epidemics, known as murrains, would sweep through the starving populace. Outbreaks of diseases like typhus, dysentery, and smallpox would carry off far more people than starvation itself. You might survive the hunger, only to be killed by a fever your body was too weak to fight. You are left with a hollow, aching, and dizzying feeling of true hunger. You have chewed on tree bark until your jaw ached and dug for bitter roots with your bare hands. You have seen your neighbors, once friends you shared ale with, look at you with the distant, haunted eyes of a starving animal. You now understand that for all our talk of salty meat and gritty bread, the most disgusting food in the medieval world was, paradoxically, no food at all. It was the complete and terrifying absence of sustenance, an absence that stripped away everything it meant to be human. This grim reality was, thankfully, not a constant state. In normal times, you were not eating bark. You were eating pottage, guided by a complex and bizarre medical theory that dictated exactly what your food should be and why. To understand the normal, non-famine diet, we must now explore the strange logic of that theory. This grim reality of famine was, thankfully, not a constant state. In normal times, you were not eating bark. You were eating pottage, guided by a complex and bizarre medical theory that dictated exactly what your food should be and why. To truly understand the strange combinations and often disgusting logic of the medieval menu, you have to understand the theory that governed every single bite. We've touched on it before, but now we must dive into the strange world of the humoral diet. As we've learned, your body was believed to be a vessel containing 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each had a corresponding quality. Blood was hot and wet. Phlegm was cold and wet. Yellow bile was hot and dry. And black bile was cold and dry. Health was the result of these 4 fluids being in perfect balance. Sickness was the result of one humor becoming excessive. Now, here is the crucial step. This system was applied to everything you could possibly eat or drink. Every ingredient in the kitchen, from a carrot to a carp, was also classified as being hot, cold, wet, or dry to a certain degree. The dietary advice that stemmed from this was, to our minds, utterly bizarre. Let's take that fish you were forced to eat on Fridays. In the humoral system, fish was considered one of the most profoundly cold and moist foods you could possibly eat. This is one reason it was seen as a suitable food for penance. Its coldness was believed to dampen the passions and promote humility. On the other end of the spectrum, spices like pepper and ginger were classified as extremely hot and dry. Wine was also hot and dry. An onion was hot and dry. A cucumber, on the other hand, was cold and moist, just like the fish. The foundational rule of the humoral diet was to achieve balance through opposition. You should never, ever eat too much of a food with one quality without counteracting it with a food of the opposite quality. This is the secret code that explains some of the strangest medieval recipes. You would never just eat a plain piece of boiled fish. To do so would be to invite a dangerous excess of cold and moist phlegm into your system. It was considered medically irresponsible. Instead, you had to cook that cold fish with hot ingredients. This is why fish was so often poached in wine hot and dry, and then absolutely smothered in a sauce made from vinegar hot and dry and a barrage of spices like pepper, cloves, and ginger, all hot and dry. The spices were not just there to make the fish taste less muddy. They were a medical necessity to make it safe to consume. To eat fish without a spicy, acidic sauce was like playing with humoral fire, or rather, humoral water. This logic permeated every corner of the kitchen. A nice crisp salad might seem healthy to us, but lettuce was considered a cold and moist food. Therefore, you would douse it in a dressing of oil and vinegar, both hotter and drier, to balance it out. The classic pairing of pork, a moist meat with applesauce. A drier fruit has its roots in this same humoral balancing act. The cooking method itself was part of the calculation. Roasting was a drying method of cooking, while boiling was a moistening one. So, if a food was considered too moist, like a cucumber, the healthiest way to prepare it would be to roast it, driving out its dangerous moisture. The thought of a roasted cucumber, limp and warm, is a perfect example of a disgusting but humorally correct medieval dish. This system also meant that your diet had to be personalized to your own unique humoral makeup, or complexion, as well as your age and location. If you were a young, vigorous man with a naturally sanguine, hot and moist temperament, you would be advised to avoid eating too many foods that were also hot and moist, like rich, fatty meats, lest you create a dangerous excess of blood. Why? If you were an old, melancholic scholar, cold and dry, and you could see in a drafty library Your physician would prescribe a diet rich in hotech and moist foods to bring you back into balance. You would be told to eat plenty of red meat and game birds, and to drink lots of good, strong, hot wine. Your diet was your prescription. But did people actually follow these complex and often unappazing rules to the letter? This is a question historians still argue about. How strictly was the humoral diet applied in the kitchens of the wealthy, who were the only ones who could afford the variety of ingredients to even attempt it? On one hand, the cookbooks and medical texts of the period are filled with this advice. The wealthy paid physicians enormous sums of money to create personalized dietary plans, and since health was so precarious, it seems logical they would have taken this advice seriously. This was the best science of their day. On the other hand, we have to account for basic human nature. People like to eat things that taste good. It seems probable that while the theory was always in the background, taste, tradition, and the desire to display wealth often won out over strict medical adherence. A cook might add a bit of ginger to a dish because he knew it was a hot spice that would balance a cold ingredient, but he would also add it because it imparted a delicious, fiery taste that his lord enjoyed. And a lord might know, in theory, that he shouldn't be eating so much rich, roasted meat, but he would do it anyway because it was a sign of his status and power. The humoral diet was most likely a flexible guideline rather than an ironclad rule, a system that provided a framework for thinking about food, but one that could be bent for the sake of flavor or spectacle. So you are now equipped with the strange and wonderful logic of the medieval kitchen. You can see the world of food through their eyes. A meal is not just a collection of flavors and textures. It is a complex medical calculation. Every dish is an attempt to fine-tune the delicate machinery of the human body. The choice of ingredients, the method of cooking, and the combination of flavors are all part of a grand system designed to maintain a precarious and precious cosmic balance. The goal wasn't just to fill the belly, a task that was often hard enough, but to ensure that the four humors within remained in perfect harmonious alignment. This intense focus on ingredients and balance, however, sometimes paled in comparison to another, even more pressing goal, especially when guests were present. The goal of pure spectacle, the grand feast, was where all these elements that questionable meet. The strange pairings, the expensive spice game together in a final, deceptive and often truly disgusting performance. This intense focus on ingredients and balance, however, sometimes paled in comparison to another, even more pressing goal, especially when guests were present. The goal of pure spectacle, the grand feast, was where all these elements the questionable meet, the strange pairings, the expensive spice game together in a final, deceptive, and often truly disgusting performance. This was not about a quiet, delicious meal. This was about power. This was culinary theater. Imagine you are a guest at a great feast, celebrating a wedding or a major holiday. You are not in a quiet restaurant. You are in the great hall of a castle, a vast, cavernous space. The stone walls are covered with colorful tapestries to keep out the drafts. The air is thick with the smoke from dozens of torches in the central hearth. The noise is immense. The chatter of 100 guests, the music from the minstrel's gallery, the baying of hunting dogs waiting for scraps under the tables. The whole experience is a multi-sensory assault before a single bite of food has been served. The meal itself is not a neat progression of appetizer, main, and dessert. It is a series of waves or removes. For each remove, a procession of servants will march into the hall, often to the sound of trumpets, carrying a dozen or more different dishes at once. These are laid out on the long trestle tables, a stunning, chaotic display of abundance. And at the center of it, all are the showpieces, the dishes designed not just to be eaten, but to be gaped at in awe. You might see a whole roasted boar, its tusks gilded with a scorched apple in its mouth, or an entire roasted swan, its neck arched gracefully, But something is strange. The swan is covered in its own feathers. The cook's staff has painstakingly roasted the bird, let it cool, and then meticulously redressed the carcass in its own plumage, using a paste of egg whites or honey to stick every feather back in place. It looks like a living, sleeping swan, a masterpiece of culinary taxidermy. You gaze upon this magnificent refeathered bird, a testament to the cook's incredible artistry. But a question naturally arises in your mind. Are you actually supposed to eat that? This is a subject historians still argue about. Was the refeathered peacock or swan a dish to be eaten, or was it purely for show? One school of thought argues that it was essentially an elaborate, inedible centerpiece. The process of roasting and then refeathering would take hours. By the time it reached the table, the meat would be cold, and the skin would be coated in a sticky, unpleasant paste. It seems more likely that this was a dummy bird, there for the spectacle, while the actual meat of the swan was carved up in the kitchen, heated, and served in a more conventional, heavily sauced manner. However, other accounts suggest that, yes, they did eat it. The guest of honor would carve into the cold, decorated bird, and guests would be served a piece of the tough, cold, feather-pasted meat. It would have been a disgusting mouthful, but the act of eating the spectacle was part of the experience. It was a demonstration of a host so wealthy he could afford to sacrifice flavor entirely for the sake of a visual flourish. This love of deception and spectacle reached its zenith with the dishes known as entremets, which translates to between the courses. These were playful, bizarre, and sometimes outright fraudulent creations designed to entertain and astonish the guests. An entremet could be a kind of culinary joke. A cook might bake a meatloaf inside a helmet-shaped mold, then decorate it to look exactly like a knight's helmet. He might craft meatballs to look like apples, coloring them with vegetable juices and sticking a real twig in the top for a stem. He might create fake eggs from almond milk blancmange, with a carefully placed apricot for the yolk. But the most famous and most disgusting of all entremets was the live bird pie. The concept was simple but audacious. The kitchen staff would bake a massive, deep pastry case known as a coffin. This pie shell was baked empty and hollow. Just before serving, a flap would be cut in the bottom, and dozens of live bird starlings, sparrows, or blackbirds would be funneled inside, and the lid sealed back on. The pie would be brought to the table, looking like any other massive pie. The guest of honor would then be given a knife to cut into the crust. As the knife pierced the lid, the flock of terrified birds would burst forth, flying up into the rafters of the great hall in a chaotic, flapping explosion. Imagine the scene. It's a moment of pure spectacle, of laughter and astonishment. But it is also objectively disgusting. The pie crust, a food item, is filled with flapping, terrified, and undoubtedly defecating live animals. It was the height of medieval dinner theater, a perfect example of how the experience of the feast often had nothing to do with the quality of the food itself. As you sit at this feast, you can see all the threads of our journey coming together. The meat you are served has that slight gamey tang of imperfect preservation, a flavor now completely buried under a thick, sweet-sour sauce, loaded with a king's ransom and cinnamon and cloves. You scoop the sauce up not with a fork, but with a piece of your trencher, the slab of stale bread that serves as your plate. The bizarre food pairings, a cold fish with a hot sauce, a moist meat with a dry fruit, are all dictated by the intricate, invisible logic of humoral theory. And later in the evening, after the bird-filled pies have been cleared away, a massive sugar sculpture of a castle will be brought out. A monument of inedible art meant only to be admired. The feast is a performance of plenty, but it is a deeply deceptive one. It is an attempt to create an illusion of perfection and control over a food system that was, at its core, fraught with decay, scarcity, and monotony. It was a desperate, theatrical, and often truly disgusting attempt to impose order and delight onto a world of gritty bread and endless pottage. The entire medieval culinary experience, from the peasant's humble hearth to the lord's high table, was a testament to human ingenuity, A story of survival, science, and spectacle in the face of a fundamentally grim and punishing reality. And so, the last trumpet sounds its fanfare. The minstrels in the gallery lay down their lutes, and the great hall, once a cacophony of feasting and laughter, slowly begins to empty. Our feast is over. The spectacular, re-feathered swan has been cleared away, and the last of the spiced wine has been drunk. The vivid, chaotic, and often overwhelming world of the medieval table now begins to recede, its sharp flavors and pungent smells softening into the quiet fabric of a story that has been told. The journey you have taken is at its end. The gritty bread, the salty meat, the muddy fish, the endless pottage, you can let them all go now. The constant low-level anxiety that underscored every mouth fear of spoilage, the worry of the next harvest, the complex calculations of the humoral diet can finally be released. The person you were on this journey, the one who navigated this treacherous culinary landscape, can now set down their wooden spoon and rest. Your work is done. You are no longer there at that noisy table. You are here, in the deep peace of your own room. Become aware of the simple, clean stillness that surrounds you. There is no smoky haze from 100 torches, no smell of roasting meat or spilled ale. The air is clear and calm. The silence is not the brief pause between a minstrel's songs, but a profound and gentle quiet that belongs only to you. In this present moment, feel the comfort of your own bed, the softness of your own pillow. There is no gritty bread in your pantry. There is no pot of perpetual stew simmering on your stove. The water from your tap runs clear and safe, with no need for boiling or brewing to make it so. Let yourself appreciate, for a gentle moment, the quiet miracle of your own kitchen. It is a place of predictable comfort, of freshness and choice, a world away from the daily struggle for sustenance you have just witnessed. The food you have is safe. The flavors are clear and true. Your mealtime is a source of pleasure and nourishment, not a battle against decay or a performance of status. Let the gratitude for that simple modern reality be a soft, warm blanket. The last images of the medieval world can now fade away completely. Let the sight of the great hall dissolve like sugar in wine. Let the taste of cloves and honey melt from your tongue. Let the memory of the feast become distant, a faint echo in a far-off land. All that is left now is the gentle reality of your own body at rest, your breathing slowing into a steady, easy rhythm. The story has been told, and the mind can now be still. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to learn. There's only the peaceful welcome pull of sleep, drawing you down into its soft and quiet darkness. Let the comfort soothe you. Let your thoughts drift away like smoke. Sweet dreams.